Hello, folks. We're live on the broadcast, Jay Talking, broadcast, call it what you will, with Dean Michael Coyne. And it's a pleasure to be with Dean Coyne on this brisk day in New England. How do you do, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm very well. We talked a little bit before we began here, and we're remarking on how you get used to things, and you get used to the cold weather. You kind of get used to the new COVID reality. Mike Coyne is the dean of the Massachusetts School of Law, and he's been doing it for a long time. And he's starting a new semester. You say you're doing orientation now?
Yep, we did orientation the other night. We have it again today as well, and another semester begins. So hopefully everyone will be careful and we'll all be safe as we start another semester.
By the way, a lot of folks are quitting their jobs, looking for a better life. They're quitting these low-paying jobs and saying, you know what, I'm with, you know, when you look at the uncertainties of COVID, I'm going to live my life. I'm going to be all that I can be. And people are going back to school. Can you talk a little bit about adults who are enrolled at the Mass School of Law? And
Sure.
I will go ahead.
I think a lot of people are reassessing their life choices in essence. And I don't think it's just people in lower paying jobs. I think they look at their commitment to work and how much time that consumes of their life. And they want to do something different, something they might enjoy more. And we've always had that experience here. We offer both day and evening classes. And so what you're likely to see, especially in the evening, is people looking to change their careers. And so the average age at our law school overall is in the 30s, where if you looked at other law schools, it would be in the 20s, right? Oftentimes 23, 24 max, the average age. We're here, we're in the mid 30s. And what you'd find also is people really looking to change the next 30, 40, 50 years of their life. So I think you are seeing that to a much greater extent. And I think COVID is making all of us reassess our the time we spend at work, the time we spend with our family and our loved ones, the time we spend doing things we like to do, instead of living to work, working less so that we can live a little more.
Right. You know what? I feel like I bonded to you because our shirts are kind of the same. So I'm going to go ahead and go all out here. I wanted to be dressed up because I take what we
I
do
thought you
seriously.
looked good there.
But
You
we're
still
going to
look
go.
good.
We're going to be mountain men. Okay, a couple of mountain men. So what Dean Coyne and I do is go through the current events legally, and there are a number of things that caught my eye. The first one is the Vanessa Bryant case. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department's accused of unsavory doings when it comes to photos that were allegedly taken of the Kobe Bryant crash and circulated. And there's now a lawsuit, and the people are saying that the county's going to lose and she's going to win. One thing that bothers me is that she has to prove that there was, mental distress, that she was unduly distressed by these photos. And you would think that would be a default situation. Can you just talk about that case and cases like it?
Yep, because it actually fits into a general model. I tell my civil procedure students is that in every civil case, the plaintiff has to prove two things: liability and damages. And the liability is simply that there is a violation of some legal right, such that your rights have been violated, your space in some instances have been violated, or your body has been violated. But there has to be some legal injury, an injury that the law recognizes. And that's what we call liability. But that's only half of the equation, because liability without damage means that you're not going to recover. So in almost all cases, you have to prove both liability and actual damages. So that's the question is, well, how and what did you suffer in the order of damages? And so we look for actual proof on that in most cases. And oftentimes, if you think about it, If it's a breach of contract case and someone was supposed to paint your house, well, and they didn't, well, what did you pay ultimately to have the house painted? And what's the difference between those two contracts? That's your damage. In a personal injury case, oftentimes it's going to be your medical expenses, your lost wages, your loss of use and enjoyment of your body and the like. Those things that you have been damaged as a result of the legal violation. Most cases, you have to prove actual damages. In some cases, you can simply request what we call nominal damages. So, for instance, in Massachusetts, if you violate the consumer fraud statute, you're entitled to a $25 damage award if you can't prove damages. That's in essence what we would call nominal damages. But Vanessa Bryant isn't looking for nominal damages. What she's looking for is a significant award, both to compensate her and it probably in some ways to deter that type of behavior from people who don't have the resources that she has. So the question becomes, well, what's her evidence? What support does she have that she has been actually damaged? And as you pointed out when we thought about this, well, wouldn't anyone be emotionally distressed if they knew such actions were taking place?
If they saw these photos online.
Well, and that's correct. As people, we can understand that. From the courts, while we can still understand it, we need to see the proof, the evidence. So oftentimes emotional distress damages are going to be supported by things that we could rationally think about would show some emotional distress. Did you gain weight? Did you lose weight? Did you have an inability to sleep? Were you sleeping all the time? Could you eat? Did you need medication to assist you? Did you need counseling to assist you through this period where this took place, both initially and long term? What evidence do we have that would support the emotional distress claims? Because that's what will ultimately mean that she would be entitled to damages in that regard. Even though, as a general matter, we all accept someone passing around photos of our loved ones when they're dead and in such horrible condition obviously affects us greatly. We need to see support for that in order to put a dollar value on that figure.
One thing that's interesting is you need to show physical signs of your emotional distress to prove that you had the emotional distress, where, I don't know, there might not be any. It seems maybe they need to simply show the photos in court and say to the jury, so what do you think? Do you think you would suffer emotional distress, seeing your family scattered all over a hillside or whatever?
But see, Bradley, that's not enough, because at the end of the day, they can't just pluck a number out of the air and say, okay, we'll give you $5 million.
Yeah.
The evidence has to support it. And you're right. It is kind of interesting to look for the physical manifestation of emotional distress. But if we use our common sense and our experience, we do know that when we're depressed, we act and look differently than when we're happy and enjoying ourselves. And so what's the evidence that you have that shows that? And that can be not just, the documentation of bills and medical bills and expenses like that, but it can be testimony from friends as to how your behavior changed after these incidents that caused the legal injury than you were before. And it's not going to take a lot for a jury likely to find that this was a really lousy thing to do that deserves to be sufficiently compensated. But in civil cases, we have to draw a distinction between trying to make you whole, to put you back in the position you would have been, but for the wrong done to you as best as money can, and make a distinction between that and a violation of a criminal statute where we're looking for punishment. In some civil cases, you're entitled to get punitive damages, but that they're actually much more rare than people think. Punitive damages in civil cases are designed to punish. and this may be appropriate that as people would see it. The question is, does California law allow for punitive damages in such a situation? In most cases, most states do not allow for a broad range of punitive damage awards.
All right, we have some other things to get to. The COVID-related lawsuits. There's a case in California at a candy company that was allowed to go forward in a situation where an employee was said to have been infected by the coronavirus while working inches apart, and then her husband caught it at home, and he's allowed to go forward. It seems like an endless loop of potential liability. What do you think?
There isn't. I mean, this is the new world we live in, and COVID is obviously everywhere, and its legal implications are everywhere. My recollection is that when we started discussing this over almost 2 years ago now, this is precisely what we discussed. Is the only people that are likely going to benefit by this are the lawyers, as it turns out, the drug companies as well. But oftentimes during these periods, there is an awful lot of litigation over the various issues. And as we know, both at the Supreme Court level, we had recent arguments on vaccine mandates or testing issues. And we're also seeing it at the much more the baseline level. Is under what circumstances do I have to go into work if I have COVID? Can I get sick leave? Is this workers' comp? How far does that liability extend? And I believe that if you place your employees in highly dangerous conditions and they ultimately then get sick as a result of those poor decisions, then obviously liability, in my opinion, should lie. And that the employee shouldn't be the one that bears the financial risk. It should be the person that put them in that position.
It's tough because employers don't have any actual guidelines that are consistent. And so they have, it's tough to decide if they were negligent because there are no guidelines really to follow. One company's guidelines is different from another. I guess just to take care of this, there need to be firm and consistent guidelines that companies can follow, correct?
Yeah, well, and that is the problem, is the consistency in the ever-changing landscape. Now, one could argue that it's the ever-changing landscape of guidelines because this thing seems to morph and change by the month. And so it's hard to be consistent because it's something we really don't have the vast amount of knowledge that we'd like to have in order to be able to say it. But that is the problem, is that what's not safe today is safe a week from now, because now we're finding that the quarantine periods are being reduced. And so what does an employer, small or big employer, do to try and ensure that their people and their customers stay safe, and especially to try and avoid the danger to those folks, but also to avoid some of the backbreaking expense of litigation when things, as they are going to during a pandemic, go wrong.
Let's go to the Maxwell case. Developments in the Maxwell case. A couple of jurors.
It's an interesting turn of events here. She was convicted. We still have a lot. I still have a lot of questions about the case. There's an awful lot of powerful and successful people that are involved in that case that the records for the most part are sealed. So we still don't know a lot of the details about those that would have been involved with her and Epstein and these sex abuse victims. So there's some concern about that level of secrecy that the case has still, because those records are sealed. But what's the latest turn in that case is, after being convicted, she was, it is held in prison as a result of it. She hasn't been sentenced yet, but she's moved for a new trial because a couple of the jurors that were on that trial ultimately then, after rendering the verdict, came out and spoke about their experiences, and not just their experiences on the jury and the deliberations, but they talked about being previous sex abuse victims. And that raises the issue and has created the issue for her about should she be entitled to a new trial under the circumstances. And oftentimes, as it comes in these types of issues, you say, well, was that information disclosed? Because that's the first thought I have is if it was disclosed, I'm kind of hard to believe that, knowing that her lawyers would not have put up a much bigger fight to try and exclude those jurors from the jury panel. So there's some details we don't know, but that raises the question: should someone who is a sex abuse victim be allowed to serve ultimately down the road on a sex abuse trial? And if we're going to say no, why not? Right? Why not? So that you're automatically excluded, because rarely do we automatically exclude anyone from jury service.
So that would be the first question one would ask when impaneling a jury. Have you ever been sexually assaulted? Right? Is it possible that the defense knew about this and thought, you know what, well, maybe we'll use that as a card later down the line if things aren't going well. We'll say, oh yeah, by the way, 2 of these jurors have been sexually assaulted, so we need a new trial. Is that a tactic?
No, I don't think it would have been a tactic. I would think that in the jury questionnaire that jurors complete, and oftentimes there's a generic one for sort of run-of-the-mill cases, but most of us as lawyers would add questions to it if we're permitted to, that would be more tailored to the case that we're trying. So it gives us a little more insight into the minds of the jurors and their backgrounds, because what we're looking for, obviously, is a jury that would view the evidence we are going to submit favorably. So I can't imagine that the question wasn't asked. If it wasn't, I would actually think that it might very well be malpractice, because we ask about everything else. Do you have a family member in law enforcement? Have you ever been a victim of a crime? The problem, as I think we start to go down this rabbit hole and we start to really think about it, I think the statistics are on nationwide, is that we would be shocked to see the level of the percentage of people who have been victims of sexual abuse at one point in their lives. And that is kind of both the alarming question that we have. And then, so if that question is on the questionnaire, would we be excluding 40% of the population, 50% of the population? And by the way, just because they shouldn't necessarily be excluded. The fact is, just because you are aware of a case or have some familiarity with the facts or even some experience with the facts in the case, that doesn't mean you're disqualified from jury service. What you have to be able to do to sit as a juror is to say, whatever else happened in the background, whatever else I know about this case presently, I'm willing to put all that aside and view the case solely on the evidence submitted in this courtroom. And if you're able to do that, the fact that you know a lot about the case, the fact that you may have some shared experiences on either the government's witnesses side or the defendants and the defendant's witnesses side, doesn't mean you're automatically excluded. We tend to take people at their word as best we can as to their ability to view the evidence introduced in the courtroom.
Okay, now the Floyd case. Next step in the Floyd case.
Yep. Well, the next step in the Floyd case is that we have the 3 officers who stood by and watched Derek Chauvin murder, as it turns out, George Floyd, are now going on trial within the next 10 days for the civil rights violations that cost George Floyd his life. And as you might guess, obviously it raises all of these issues again with respect to how Mr. Floyd met this horrible death, and whether these people now should be convicted of the civil rights violations for not taking steps to prevent the abuse he suffered.
And what about follow up a year later to the Capitol riot? Call it what you
Yeah.
will. What's going on with that? And where does Mr. Trump sit in all of that at this point?
Well, what the heck, right? I mean, I was reading an article yesterday. It said Merrick Garland promised us justice for the January 6th events quite some time ago. Where is it? Where is the beef, to use an old phrase that you and I are old enough to be familiar with? Is that why haven't we seen more of the testimony? Why haven't we seen any arrests of not just the people found present within the building, but those that may have contributed this to these events on a much higher level? Why haven't we seen any indictments or any other law enforcement action against the more significantly influential people that were involved in January 6th? I wish I could tell you, other than, I'll fall back on the old adage that the wheels of justice grind slowly, but this is way too slowly.
It just seems that the president is completely bulletproof and just a master at manipulating the system and delaying and running out the clock. Is this a case of rich people get better justice than poor people?
Yep. I mean, to put it succinctly, you're absolutely right, is that if you have the money and the influence, you can drag things out for an interminable period, which they're doing, exhaust every legal avenue. And the fact is that the rich and powerful understand how to work that process far better than people of more modest means, or people who are in our district courts, in our superior courts. It's an unfortunate part of the system, is that there is an ability to game the system, and especially if you have significant financial resources, such that you can pay lawyers in various states and federal courts to be able to drag proceedings out, slow it down, and to really take advantage of all of your legal rights. The fact is, oftentimes, there is a benefit to dragging things out, slowing the process down, and there will be victories along the way then for those parties, simply because they've taken more opportunities to get those victories.
One thing that's shocking to me is that the lack of response to that action on January 6th. You would expect that if you and a group of people stormed the Capitol and tried to take it over, you'd get shot. I mean, that's why they have guards with guns. That's why they're there. Wasn't it shocking to you that did not happen? What do you suppose is the reason? Do you think it's just because that was so far out of anybody's expectations that it was just, we're not prepared to do that? But aren't you trained to use force if a mob is trying to take over the Capitol?
You would think there would have been a more concerted action to stop those invaders from getting access to the Capitol. That, my understanding is, that's a research and investigation of another part of this case that talks about whether there were those within the administration that prohibited efforts to activate the National Guard and others in advance. I mean, that should be all part of the commission's investigation as to how it went so badly, so fast. But I think part of it is what you said, is whoever would have expected such horrible and heinous actions by, a mob in our own capital prior to January 6th. And that's the worry too, is, well, then that's why we need law enforcement action, and we need much more information on this to make sure that this doesn't happen again, and that we take steps to make sure that it doesn't advance. Something like this can never advance that far, that fast again.
I worry that other groups will take a look at that, and see how easy it was.
Yes,
There could be foreign actors that said, "Wow, God, that was easy. We could organize something a lot more dangerous." And
I couldn't agree more.
hopefully, if steps have been taken to fix that. But yeah, I just don't have the confidence that things are the way I thought they were. You like to think that people have it together up in high levels, and they don't. They just don't. It's disappointing.
Not going to get a disagreement. You'd like to have more and that's sort of the seed of all this, isn't it? You'd like to have more confidence in our government's ability to deal with a whole bunch of issues. But isn't that what, at least in part, fuels some of this and fueled some of January 6th?
Yeah.
Is the lack of confidence in our government actors. And unfortunately, this has helped to fuel that, even on those of us, for those of us that really do want to support and believe that good government is possible, and that the government, when they knock on our door and say they're there to help, they actually are.
I guess. And finally, on the president, it's pretty clear that he wanted that to happen, and he, at the very least, did not do what could be reasonably expected that one would do to stop it. And there's always the possibility that that he was more directly behind it. Is he ever going to be a defendant in this?
And I think you and I agree on that. But let's be clear, because not everyone does, right? Not everyone thinks that his actions were inappropriate, or certainly criminal. And that's the piece here to think about, is the law part of it. Criminal actions require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Certainly, a lot of this, one would argue, falls within our First Amendment rights to speak about the ills of government, and the belief, whether founded or not, that the election was stolen and all the rest. So some of that is legitimate speech, and political speech is always given pretty wide berth by the courts. And so that's the problem as you start to think about it. If he were to be charged criminally, the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. That may be very, very difficult to get a conviction. It will be very, very difficult to get a conviction on certainly the president and those at that senior level for what they did, based on what we know right now. But I don't think we know half of what's out there. The civil suits, though, and there are civil suits already pending, are going to use a standard of proof of preponderance of evidence, more likely than not. And that's where you very well may see a different outcome in these cases, is that, okay, it's one thing to say we're going to charge you criminally and we have to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt as to the president and his family and those top level officers in the administration, their involvement. It's another thing to prove on liability in a civil case, to say your actions were sufficiently reckless that they caused significant damage, both to many of the officers who were physically injured that day, as well as to others. That you may very well see some type of justice, not in the criminal system at that higher level, but in the civil system, based on the different standards of proof.
Will the president be a defendant in a civil case like that, based on negligence or something?
Yeah, exactly. And partly he would argue that at least some of what he was doing is immune because he's acting as the president of the United States. But there are certainly parts of his activities that he was operating more as a political candidate, not in his official capacity as the president of the United States.
So he's protected. A police officer would not be protected for negligence, but the president is.
Well, the police officer, remember, and this has been a significant debate over the last few years, as we saw some law enforcement officers abuse their authority, that there is an immunity level that the police officers have, And we're also seeing some of that. The various legislatures look at that and saying, okay, we've got to revisit this because too many of these cases are being dismissed when they're filed in federal courts on the basis that the officer didn't go so far outside his job duties to create liability. We give those in law enforcement, the president, we give them some benefit of the doubt that there are going to be actions they take that don't automatically mean there's liability, because they have to take so many actions and sometimes with very little time really to be able to work that through.
Did you happen to watch American Insurrection on Frontline?
I have not seen it yet. I've seen parts of it, and I've seen parts of the other pieces of this as well. I saw, I don't think it was American Insurrection. I saw one documentary on this, and I can't recall the name right now. It was alarming when you saw it with all the inside footage and what was taking place. It was not alarming. It was scary as hell.
Right.
That could happen in Washington, D.C., our capital, and not some third world country where we don't know how to take care of ourselves.
Right. So when you watch American Insurrection, you'll see that what happened in the Capitol, in that insurrection, really wasn't a bolt out of the blue. That the template for this, as well as the template for the things the president says related to it, had been established earlier, and like Michigan, I believe it was. And so you see a pattern. Would showing a pattern like that have an effect on a civil suit?
Well, sure. The question then it becomes, I mean, and if you do look at some of the background on this and some of the precursor incidents, like the attempted kidnapping of the governor in Michigan and the like, this doesn't come out of the blue that this highly reckless speech could ultimately result in grave danger and even death. And that's where the civil liability comes into play, really, is that at some point you knew or should have known that by this constant threats, constant encouragement of other individuals, that it becomes not just negligent. To me, at some point, it becomes grossly reckless. And if it's grossly reckless, there's a basis for criminal charges as well. But certainly, when we talk about reckless, when we talk about negligence that you said, what we're using really, take negligence, which is a legal term, and just switch it with a term we're all much more familiar with, which is carelessness, because that's what negligence really is. Well, wasn't this incredibly careless at the minimum for the president to continue to talk about an election being stolen and ballots being thrown away, when they're really, and his lawyers and Rudy and all the rest to keep pushing that line when there really was no evidence to support it? And that's why we ended up, at least in part, with this horrible nightmare on January 6th, where people died, people were severely hurt, and a lot of us lost a lot of confidence that our government can even take care of itself, much less take care of others.
You know, way back when I started out at WBC and the rock station, and we did these lunchtime concerts, and Tank was a guy who was in charge of those. And, you know, when I started out, I remember he told me, never throw a t-shirt in the audience, because if someone gets hurt going scrambling for that, you could be liable. You know, I should have a reasonable expectation that throwing a t-shirt into the audience might result in some injury, and therefore I'd be on the hook. And you would think that a jury would find that the president should have a reasonable expectation that bad things would happen given what he said. I mean, it's completely obvious that even if the things he said were not meant literally, there's a reasonable expectation that they would cause what happened to happen. Yes?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, and listen, I think Tank was right. Tank used to call in when we do the show on BZ.
Right.
there would have been fistfights over a BCN T-shirt, and if there would be, how can the president escape liability for some of this white hot speech,
Right.
encouraging his supporters to, I'm going to go right with you. Let's walk down the street and show these people we mean business. You know, and as one of the texter says is correct, you know, speech, free speech isn't always entirely free. There are limitations to it. And when you encourage people to riot and then they actually riot and cause significant damage, both from a personal standpoint as well as financial, there should be a price to pay for that. And it should be a lot faster than what we're seeing. And that's why I think people continue to lose confidence on both sides of these debates is, where is the justice? Because if this was some other crime in Dorchester or up here in Andover or Lawrence, the police would be a lot more active and we would have seen a lot more indictments or charges by this point. And I think they better move a lot faster than they are.
So as far as the fire in a crowded theater example goes, so that's a good example, because the president seems like he would argue, I wasn't literally saying fire. There is a fire. I meant it in some other way. I wasn't saying there was actually a fire. But if you yell fire in a crowded theater, there's certainly a reasonable expectation that they're going to think there's a fire. That might be a good example to use in court, actually.
Well, I think all you'd have to do, and I've seen it, and it might have been in one of these documentaries where they strung together over the period, as you pointed out. This wasn't a speech only on January 6th, the January 5th that gave rise to this. This was the culmination in about a 2 or 3 year period where during his rallies, he would take the protesters, drag them up, drag them out, shut them up, punch them. If you punch them, I'll defend you. I mean, he encouraged a number of violent incidents over the period of a number of years. This was just the culmination of having whipped his supporters up for that period of time, and with the natural consequences one would expect. I would think that the limitations of free speech he should have been well aware of, and he far exceeded well before January 6th.
You know, I would say that he might win in court, but so let's do it. Let's go to court. Let's get it all out there and see what happens. I agree with you. Why isn't this moving forward? Do you think that the powers that be think it's politically expedient to not have a trial?
I really don't know. I think in part, no matter when it happens or what goes forward, we are so polarized. People are going to say, oh, it's just, as they've said already, it's political theater, as opposed to really taking a look at it as they did on the evening of January 6th. Even Republicans condemned what the president had done on January 6th that night. But the problem is, where is the real leadership on both sides for that matter, that the statesmen that at one point led us and that we could trust, instead of always now reverting to, well, what's the politics of it and which side do I have to be on depending on whether I want to be reelected or not. And that's the concern I think a lot of people have with respect to this, is that even if it goes forward, it's not likely to unite us. It's only going to further separate us. And that's a big problem. I think those are the consequences of the times we live in, though. I don't think you can avoid having these difficult cases and the evidence out in the public so that people can look and maybe look beyond the headlines and the screeching commentators on TV and really try to make an analysis of it as to what really happened and who's responsible. And that's what's needed. And it should be sooner rather than later.
In the final analysis, the slam dunk, mic drop, indisputable answer to one of our questions, the question of whether or not the the president was perceived by the people involved in the insurrection as having told them to go do it, if you ask them, and they have been asked, and they will tell you, and they do tell you, yes, we're here because the president told us to come. It's on tape. It's on video. You can see it. That's why they're there. And I would think that would remove a lot of the doubt, and would be pretty compelling in court to see those videos.
I agree. You know, listen, even on that day, he said, I will go with you. I will lead you down there. Of course, he then runs back to the White House. He's not going to stay around for the riot. But he, even on the day, suggested to them they were, in essence, acting as his soldiers, and General would lead them. But that didn't happen either.
Well, Dean Michael Coyne, thanks for talking with us, speaking with us on this really cold day. We're going to get a break tomorrow, only to have more cold on the way. And hopefully the COVID surge will break. And next time we speak, things will be a lot more pleasant. Thanks again. As always, it's a pleasure.
Thanks, Bradley. Thanks.
Bye now.